Hi everyone, and welcome to our video on some exam questions related to Unit 2 cell membranes. Our first question is from the 2016 AQA AS Biology Paper 1 and states the letters P, Q, R, S and T represent ways substances can move across membranes, and we're given the range of ways. So we've got simple diffusion, we've got facilitated diffusion, active transport, co-transport and osmosis. We are given three scenarios and we just need to put the correct letter in the box as to how the molecules, ions, gases are moving. Okay, so transport through a channel protein. Okay, the keyword is channel protein, and whenever we see that, it's going to be facilitated diffusion. So it's going to be Q. Okay, remember facilitated diffusion occurs with polar molecules that are not lipid soluble. The next one is transport of small non-polar molecules. Small non-polar means that they can just diffuse across the phospholipid bilayer and they are lipid soluble, so it's going to be simple diffusion P. And the final one, transport of glucose with sodium ions. Because it says with sodium ions, we know it's going to be co-transport. Okay, so we've got Q, P and S. And if I show you the mark scheme, it's really simple. You just get a mark for each correct answer. That's why it's 3 marks in total. Next question. Figure 3 shows part of a plant cell and how it produces the cell wall. Y is a protein. One function of Y is to transport cellulose molecules across the phospholipid bilayer. Use information from figure 3. Describe the other function of Y. So if we have a look at figure 3, we can see that this is the phospholipid bilayer and the cellulose molecules are on the outside of the cell membrane. We also see this keyword, which is substrate, and whenever we see the keyword substrate, we know that it's something related to an enzyme. Okay, so that's the first mark. Because the substrate is going through this channel protein, we know that Y has to be an enzyme. Okay, so Y is an enzyme. Okay, and it's going to bind to the substrate and it's going to form an enzyme substrate complex. Okay, and what are the products? After the substrate has bound to the active site of the enzyme and an enzyme substrate complex has been formed, what's the products? Well, as you can see towards the end, we can see that cellulose is being produced. Okay, so our second mark would be for saying that cellulose has been produced. Okay, and that would be worth 2 marks. If I show you the mark scheme to the question, as you can see, through this mark scheme, we get a mark for saying that Y is an enzyme. It has an active site and forms an enzyme substrate complex. And we also get a mark for saying that cellulose is being produced. Okay, and it does say mark in pairs, so you can either have this for 2 marks or this for 2 marks. You can't have 1 point from here and 1 point from here. You have to have them in pairs, just as it says in the mark scheme. Okay, if we move on to our next question, what is the evidence from figure 3 that the phospholipid shown is part of the cell surface membrane? So if we go back over here, we know that this is our cell membrane and we know that cellulose is being produced. Now, if we have a look at any sort of diagram of a cell, let's have a look at a plant cell, such as this. We're going to have these 2 layers. The inner layer is going to represent the cell membrane and the outer layer is going to be representing the cell wall. Okay, now in this image we can see that the substrate is binding to the enzyme and the enzyme is producing these cellulose molecules. Okay, so what evidence can be shown that the phospholipid bilayer is part of the cell surface membrane? Well, the cell membrane is always on the inside of the cell wall. Okay, so we can say that the cell wall forms on the outside of the cell surface membrane as our evidence. As we can see, the cell wall, the cellulose molecules are there, and the phospholipid bilayer is here. Therefore, the cell wall is being formed on the outside of the cell membrane. Okay, so the cell wall forms on the outside of the cell surface membrane, or you can say that the cell wall has cellulose and forms on the outside of the cell membrane. Okay, and that would be worth 1 mark. Okay, so if we have a look at the next question, in the cell wall, bonds hold the cellulose molecules together side by side. Tick one box that describes the type of bond that holds the cellulose molecules together. So this is a recap from biological molecules. Remember, cellulose molecules are held together by hydrogen bonds, which collectively provide strength to the cell wall. Okay. Now this question is from the 2016 AQA A-level biology paper 1. It says glucose is absorbed from the lumen of the small intestine into epithelial cells. Explain how the transport of sodium ions is involved in the absorption of glucose by epithelial cells. So this is like a model answer you would need to learn, as it's a common one for exam, but again it's explicitly mentioned in the specification. Okay, so if I show you the mark scheme for this question straight away, we've got sodium ions leave the epithelial cell and enter the blood. Remember, it's ions. It says in the question, so it will say it in the mark scheme. Okay, and it says penalize for Na without ions once. Okay, so if you say it, you're going to lose the mark. Okay, so sodium ions leave the epithelial cell and enter the blood. So let's say we've got the sort of epithelial cell here, we've got our lumen here, and we've got our blood here. Okay, this is our cell, this is our lumen, and this is our blood. Okay, we've got a high concentration of sodium ions in the blood and a lower concentration in the cell. So sodium ions are going to move from the cell into the blood, and that's going to happen via active transport, and ATP is going to be required because there's more sodium ions which are in the blood compared to in the cell. Okay, now once the sodium ions move by active transport from the cell into the blood, there's a lower concentration of sodium ions in the cell. Okay, there's a lower concentration of sodium ions in the cell, and there's a higher concentration of sodium ions in the lumen. Okay, now sodium ions can move from the lumen into the cell via a facilitated diffusion. Okay, because sodium ions, they are not lipid soluble, therefore just cannot diffuse across the phospholipid bilayer, therefore they require facilitated diffusion. Okay, and they diffuse across this thing called a co-transporter protein. Okay, and that allows the sodium ions to bind to the protein, and it also takes along glucose with it. Okay, so we've got glucose here as well. However, we need more glucose present in the bloodstream and cells, therefore glucose is taken in with the sodium ions, which is traveling by facilitated diffusion. Okay, so we are taking in the glucose into the cell by the opposite of active transport, or indirect active transport, as it says over here. We are using the sodium ions to transport the glucose into the cell. Okay, and that's where your 5 marks are coming for in this question. Okay, final question is just the part B to question 8. Oxygen and chloride ions can diffuse across cell surface membranes. The diffusion of chloride ions involves a membrane protein. The diffusion of oxygen does not involve a membrane protein. Explain why the diffusion of chloride ions involves a membrane protein and the diffusion of oxygen does not. So there's a really key thing over here about the content. Okay, it's an emphasis on the content. If I show you the mock scheme to this question, we can see it's everything which we have already explained. Because chloride ions, they are polar, they are charged, they cannot just cross the phospholipid bilayer just by diffusing across. Okay, they are not lipid soluble, therefore they cannot pass the phospholipid bilayer. Therefore they require a channel protein or carrier protein, as it says there. And just by stating that, you unlock your first 3 marks. Okay, facilitated diffusion. Whenever you're using a channel protein, you're going by facilitated diffusion. And you also have to state why oxygen does not require the channel protein. Well, it's because oxygen is non-polar, it's not charged, therefore it can just diffuse across the phospholipid bilayer. Okay, you could have also stated that oxygen is lipid soluble. Okay, and that would get you 5 marks to this question. And that is it for this video. Thanks for watching. I hope you liked it, and one last thing, please subscribe, hit the like button and the notification bell.